A single mother scraping by on tips at a small-town diner noticed the leather-clad biker at table 6 couldn't pay for his meal, so she quietly slid her last $20 across the table without saying a word. The next morning, she arrived at work to find over 100 Hells Angels motorcycles lined up outside her diner, engines rumbling like thunder, with their leader walking straight toward her with something that would change her life forever. But what happens when an act of kindness to a stranger becomes a debt that an entire brotherhood decides to repay? The neon sign outside Murphy's diner buzzed with electrical uncertainty, casting pink shadows across puddles that reflected a gray October sky. While inside, the smell of burnt coffee and yesterday's grease hung heavy in air, thick with the kind of silence that comes after the lunch rush dies and before the dinner crowd arrives. Sarah Martinez moved between empty tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that standing still meant thinking too much about bills piled on her kitchen counter, accusations in paper form, her worn sneakers squeaking against linoleum that had seen better decades, her uniform bearing the stains of 1,000 shifts that never quite paid enough. The register held maybe $200 on a good day, and today wasn't shaping up to be good 3 customers in the last hour, each nursing coffee long enough to justify taking up space, each leaving quarters instead of dollars, each reminder that Emma's school supplies still sat unpurchased in the back of her mind, a constant weight she bore everywhere. At table 6, the man in leather sat motionless as carved stone, his Hells Angels vest telling stories she didn't want to read, weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup like he was trying to absorb its warmth through his palms. The burger in front of him had grown cold while he stared out the rain-streaked window, and she recognized the look she'd worn it herself on nights when Emma asked for things other kids had, and Sarah had to explain why wanting and having were different countries they couldn't afford to visit. His wallet lay open beside his plate, empty except for a worn photograph of a woman with kind eyes, and when he caught her watching, he quickly closed it with the shame of one who'd counted his last dollar twice and still come up short. "More coffee?" she asked, her voice heavy with the practiced kindness of anyone who understood that dignity was often the only thing people had left. And he nodded, without looking up, calloused fingers drumming against the table in rhythm, with the rain against the windows pouring slowly. She bought him time, because she recognized the mathematics of desperation. How he glanced at the door like he was measuring escape routes. How his jaw tightened when he looked at the $23 the meal would cost. How his shoulders bore the burden of being hungry in a world full of food he couldn't afford. Emma sat in the corner booth doing homework, her pencil moving across math problems with the concentration of one who'd learned early that getting things right mattered. Her presence, a constant reminder that her mother's choices rippled beyond herself into a future that deserved better than the hand they'd been dealt. The afternoon light filtering through Murphy's windows was weighted with endings, the end of another hard day, the end of another week where money ran out before month did, the end of small hopes that maybe this time would be different. Her father had taught her that everyone deserved dignity with their meals, that hunger was a wound cutting deeper than skin, that sometimes the most important thing you could give someone wasn't food, but the chance to keep their head held high while they ate it. Now, watching this stranger struggle with that same wounded pride, the afternoon stretched thin as old elastic, each minute ticking by on the diner's ancient clock, while the man at table 6 pushed food around his plate like he was rearranging an unsolvable riddle, his eyes hollow with the look of someone who'd eaten pride for breakfast and found it bitter. She wiped the same section of counter for the 5th time, movements automatic, while her mind wandered to Emma's parent-teacher conference next week, the one where Mrs. Henderson would surely mention the field trip money still outstanding, the one where she would smile and nod and promise to take care of it, while knowing that taking care of it meant choosing between Emma's education and Emma's dinner. The man's breathing had grown shallow, hands shaking slightly as he reached for his coffee, and she understood with sudden clarity that this wasn't about a burger. This was about the last thread of self-respect, fraying in real time, about the moment when asking for help became the only option left. "I need to make a call," he said finally, his voice rough as sandpaper, but his phone sat dark and silent on the table, and she saw the truth, written in his averted eyes. There was no one to call, no cavalry coming, no salvation except the kind that had to be offered rather than asked for. In that moment of recognition, her father's voice echoed in her memory. How he used to leave extra tips for waitresses who looked tired. How he'd taught her that being broke was temporary, but being heartless was forever. How he'd said that kindness was the only currency that multiplied when you spent it. Emma looked up from her homework with those dark eyes that saw too much, that had learned to read her mother's face resembling a weather report, that deserved a world where good people didn't go hungry while others walked past. The decision crystallized like ice forming on a window, clear and inevitable, and she reached into her apron pocket, where her tips from the morning shift lay crumpled. 2 20s and a handful of singles that were supposed to buy groceries and gas and maybe, if she stretched them far enough, a small happiness for Emma. Pulling out one of the 20s, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded too many times, she walked to table 6 with steps that felt both heavy and weightless, like walking toward a cliff that might be a precipice or might be wings. The linoleum beneath her feet had absorbed decades of similar moments, small kindnesses, quiet sacrifices, the everyday heroism of people choosing compassion over caution. "Don't worry about it," she said, placing the bill beside his plate with fingers that barely trembled, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. And the man looked up with eyes that held surprise and a deeper emotion. Recognition, maybe. That angels sometimes wore aprons and served coffee in diners where neon signs flickered as prayers against the gathering dark. His weathered face crumpled for just a moment, the mask of stoic pride slipping to reveal the grateful human beneath. And she knew she'd witnessed something sacred in that instant, when walls fell down and hearts opened up. The $20 lay between them as a bridge spanning the distance between stranger and family, between desperation and hope, between the world as it was and the world as it could be. Dawn broke reluctantly over Murphy's diner the next morning, painting the empty parking lot in shades of amber and promise, but the silence that usually greeted her arrival was shattered by a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The deep, rhythmic thunder of motorcycle engines approaching like a mechanical storm. Standing frozen behind the coffee machine, hands still wrapped around the glass pot, she watched through the window as chrome and leather materialized out of the morning mist. Not one bike, but dozens, their riders emerging from the gray light, like warriors from legend. The lead motorcycle pulled directly in front of the diner's entrance, and her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the weathered face beneath the helmet yesterday's hungry stranger, now surrounded by a brotherhood that stretched down the block like a river of rebellion and loyalty. Emma pressed her face against the window from her corner booth, math homework forgotten, as she watched men who looked as if they'd stepped out of movies, who dismount their machines with the fluid grace of people who lived by codes she couldn't understand. "Mom, are those the bad guys?" she whispered. But her mother couldn't answer because her mouth had gone dry as dust, her mind racing through possibilities that ranged from gratitude to retribution, none of them making sense in the quiet world of coffee refills and morning regulars. The man from yesterday, their leader, she realized now, removed his helmet and shook out gray hair that caught the sunrise resembling silver, his eyes scanning the diner's interior until they found her face through the glass. And when he smiled, it was with an expression she couldn't read, but felt in her bones. The bell above the door chimed once, twice, then continuously as they filed in, men whose presence seemed to expand the diner's walls and shrink its safety simultaneously. Their leather vests bearing patches and symbols that spoke of roads traveled and debts honored, of loyalty that ran deeper than blood. Her hands shook as she poured coffee into cups that suddenly seemed too small, too fragile, too ordinary for men who appeared capable of reshaping the world with their will. And the normal sounds of morning, the hum of refrigeration, the tick of the clock, Emma's pencil scratching against paper, became amplified in the electric silence that followed their arrival. "You remember me," the leader said, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade through silk. And she nodded, because forgetting him would have been impossible. An earthquake or lightning strike couldn't be dismissed. He approached the counter with steps both casual and purposeful, his brothers arranging themselves around the diner like pieces on a chessboard, their presence transforming Murphy's from a simple restaurant into a place both ancient and ceremonial. "Yesterday you fed one of ours when he couldn't feed himself," he continued, his words weighted with ritual, with traditions passed down through generations of men who lived by different rules than the rest of the world. And she realized with growing amazement that this wasn't about threat or intimidation. This was about honor, about debts that couldn't be measured in money, about the kind of justice that existed outside courtrooms and law books. As if summoned by this realization, the leader reached into his vest with the solemnity of one performing a sacred act, withdrawing an envelope thick enough to change everything, its edges worn soft by careful handling, its weight heavy with implications that stretched far beyond the $20 she had given yesterday. "In our world, kindness to one is kindness to all," he said, his voice carrying across the diner like a benediction. And every patron, the elderly man with his crossword, the nurse grabbing coffee between shifts, Emma, with her wide eyes and forgotten homework, leaned forward like they were witnessing a moment destined for legend. The envelope hit the counter with a sound like destiny arriving, and when she opened it with trembling fingers, the bills inside weren't just money, they were freedom, security, the answer to prayers she'd been too tired to pray. Enough to pay rent and buy groceries and get the car fixed, and maybe, for the first time since Emma was born, enough to breathe without calculating the cost of each breath. "We take care of our own," the leader continued, his eyes holding her gaze with an intensity like being seen for the first time, really seen, not as a waitress or a single mother struggling to make ends meet, but as one whose heart was large enough to share what little she had with a stranger who needed it more. "And you, sister, are family now." And the word family hung in the air like incense, heavy with meaning that transformed the diner into something sacred, a place where ordinary kindness had become extraordinary grace. Emma stood up from her booth, her small hand finding her mother's, her presence grounding them both in the reality of this moment too large for the world they'd known yesterday. The Brotherhood began to file out as quietly as they'd entered, their engines starting in a symphony of controlled power that made the windows vibrate and the coffee cups dance on their saucers. But their leader remained, pressing a business card into her palm, with numbers she could call if trouble ever found her door. "Angels come in all forms," he said with a smile that transformed his weathered features into an almost paternal quality. "And sometimes they serve coffee in small-town diners." And she understood then that her simple act of paying for a stranger's meal had rippled outward into a vast and protective force, creating connections that transcended the boundaries of their separate worlds. As the last motorcycle disappeared down the highway, leaving only the fading echo of engines and the lingering scent of freedom, she looked at Emma's amazed face and knew they'd both learned a profound truth about the mathematics of kindness, that sometimes $20 multiplied by love equals everything you need, that angels do exist, and that they occasionally wear leather wings and ride machines that sound like thunder rolling toward justice. The neon sign outside continued its electric prayer, but now it seemed to pulse with the rhythm of motorcycle hearts, a beacon calling to all who understood that family isn't always born from blood. Sometimes it's forged from the simple decision to care about strangers who turn out to be brothers in disguise.